Good morning, Andrew Steele from Jarden. The first one for me is actually just on aged care. You highlighted this time last year the $5 million impact from higher nurse wages, certainly a well-deserved pay increase. Other industry peers have highlighted the ongoing margin squeeze related to funding on the aged care side. Could you provide some sort of context as to what you've seen in terms of your care bed profitability year on year, and any sort of steps you're taking to offset any margin headwinds?
Look, I guess we're not immune from that squeeze. We continue to invest in our staff and our residents through sort of lifting our services, lifting pay rates. The funding hasn't necessarily kept up with that, so you are going to see a squeeze, but we see that as a short-term thing. When you look at the demographics and the demand coming, we'd expect that to sort of pick up. But I think it's also important when we look at the care that you look at the village and the benefit of offering that care to the wider village community, and the peace of mind that gives to the residents. So that wee squeeze you may be getting is actually benefiting you further throughout the village.
Just one on cash flow. You've highlighted this significant increase year on year. I guess if I look at that and exclude the benefit of new sales activity, is still also a very large increase and considerably ahead of profit growth. From my sort of initial take, it appears to be lower new sales receivables, a sort of unwind of that balance. Is that the large part of it that's coming in ahead of profit growth, or are there other elements that in working capital that are worth noting?
No, so that is just sort of around the timing of those cash receipts. So the receivable has come down a bit, but I guess the receivable at the end of this period is a function of our build, so we'd expect them to be significant in the second half as well in terms of the cash receipts we generate from the new build there.
And I think, Andrew, last year's operating cash flow growth in the first half of last year was also strong, so it's not like a one-off, increase. We're generating good cash flows, and when you're looking at resident receipts, $1 billion last year, 582 million in the first half. It's a significant cash generative position.
And then I guess reflecting that in your development and sales activities, would you expect to see a similar dynamic in that receivables balance in 1H versus 2H for this year?
Yes, we would.
Yeah.
Just on build rate, you've highlighted relatively high medium-term build rate. Can you provide some colour as to your expected timing around this, and whether what sort of constraints are there? Is it simply availability of sites, or would you, looking at achieving that build rate, look to a further market beyond Victoria and New Zealand?
So in the chart we showed earlier, in fact, do you want to bring it up, chaps? The build rate one. We showed that we've been through a period in the last 2 or 3 years where the build rate actually fell off a little bit. And you learn a lot of lessons, when that happens, which start off with making sure that you've got a really good land bank, which we have in place. Our plan is to lift to a sustainable build rate of about 1,600 beds and units per annum, about half of which is in Victoria, and probably half of which is in New Zealand. Now, it took us a while to get going in Victoria, and so if we were to go to another state in Australia, then we'd probably want to start investigating that sort of thing, in the sort of shorter to medium term. We wouldn't assume that we could go, and just sort of turn it on 1 year later, sort of thing. So those sort of thoughts are always in our mind, Andrew. We don't just see that we are limited by Victoria, and we see an opportunity just generally in Australia, I think.
Okay, thank you. And just the last one for me on your guidance range, could you just provide a little bit of colour as to what sort of the key variables that frame the top end and the bottom end of that range?
Yeah, I'll do that. So probably the biggest short-term variable that's always hard to predict actually is the resale volumes. On long-term modelling, it's very clear that as villages mature, resale volumes just naturally increase. So we've seen that in the first half, but you never quite know in a sort of a 6-month period. Now, there's reasonably big margins associated with some resales. This really reflects, I guess, the variability that could exist around that. That's the main part of it. But there are also a very big build program in the second half, Andrew. So I guess we'd be naive to say that building always operates on a linear, straightforward path, and I think that people understand that. Anything can delay building programs. You could have a subcontractor let you down. A few weeks ago at Devonport, we had, I think we were only able to operate cranes for about 8 hours during about a 2 or 3 week period because of wind. So there's always a bit of risk around the build program in that second half, and so that's why we felt it was appropriate on both those counts to give a range.
That's all for me. Thank you.
And just while we change over the microphone, Andrew, to your very first question around margin squeeze in care, it was really interesting to me yesterday to have the care centre at Murray Helberg Village open and to see the absolute delight that independent apartment residents had. They're not going to be in there, but the delight and comfort they have that is going to be available should they need it. You know, and that's an intangible but very valuable intangible.
They were wowed.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty cool, didn't they, Marivon?
I'm sorry, I didn't see where the
feedback.
microphone went.
Yeah.
Stephen.
Stephen Ridgewell, Craig's Investment Partners. Good morning. Just following up on Andrew's question on the guide. So we've seen sort of 6% growth in underlying NPAT in the first half, and the range is 10 to 17% for the full year. So just to clarify, the pickup in growth rate in that second half, it's chiefly coming from, you're expecting it to come from higher new sales volumes, perhaps a little bit of margin. Is that a fair
Yes,
summary?
that's right. So it's a driver of growth in the second half. It'll be principally around development margin, but also some resales growth. That's what we are assuming. Yeah.
That's helpful, thanks. And then good on the land bank, and there was that helpful chart to showing the significant growth in the last period of time.
You better get that chart up, team.
Now up to sort of just over 7,000 beds and units. And heard your comments on improving efficiency in the build cycle and consenting cycle.
Yeah.
Just interested in your thoughts on, you know, is that sort of 7,000 level sufficient to deliver on that 1,600 unit target medium term? Putting aside expansion to other states, is 4.5 years. You know, does it need to be 5 or 6? Or are you quite comfortable at 4.5 years?
Yeah. That is a great question, Stephen. And look, I think that we don't. So what we have to be mindful of is what type of sites are in the land bank. So if we take 2 sites that have been very, very difficult to develop so far, one is Karori and one is Mount Eliza. So we bought Mount Eliza for people that have owned the stock for a while. We made a pretty big song and dance about it in about 2015. It's 2019 now, and it's a complicated site to consent. Karori, likewise, there's a number of heritage issues that we've had to work through, seismic issues. And so if you had every site in the land bank like those 2, you'd need a very big land bank because, you know, not all of them are going to drop at once. So what we've looked to do is to sort of, I guess, build our development in a way that there's a good mix of sites, you know, the Havelock Norths, the Lincoln Roads, the Hobsonvilles, the you know, Touchwood, the Northwoods, that sort of things, which perhaps are a little bit easier to consent. Maybe with some really extremely high profile but more difficult sites, but not having too many of them. The general shape I would think of is that if we're building at about 1,600 beds and units per annum, say in the medium term, and that's 800 in each country, then the minimum land bank we would need would be 3,200 beds and units. So there'll be 4 years worth of stock. And one of the things that we are, I think, a hell of a lot better at now than what we were is actually when we buy land, we get on with it a lot quicker. And you can see that Aberfeldy is a good case in point, and so are some of the other recent consents we've got. Yeah.
That's very helpful, thanks. And just another question on the build rate. So helpful to have that guidance for 900 units of beds this year. Yeah. I would have thought at this point, just given you know the consents that have come through in the last few months and such, you'd have a reasonable idea of what FY21 might look like. Are you able to give even a broad range as to what you'd be hoping to be completing into FY21?
And Dave hates me answering these sort of questions, but I shall. Look, it could be moving to the nearer the 1,000 level.
Yep.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Are you happy with that?
I'm happy with that.
Okay, that's great. And then just one last one from me. Talking to a few other operators in Australia, with the impact of the Royal Commission and the impact on sort of purchasing behaviour, if you like, there seems to have been we're hearing from some other operators that it's more of a shift towards newer stock, clearer terms and that kind of thing in terms of preferences. Maybe some move in the RAD-DAP kind of mix as well. Can you just talk perhaps just more broadly as to the impact you're seeing in consumer behaviour in Australia and as a result of that Royal Commission and the publicity around it, and how Ryman's positioned to respond to that?
Yeah. Yeah. If you haven't had experience in aged care, which is the majority of people, what you've been reading about in the paper for retirement villages is that there's some things you should really watch out for. And then in relation to the Royal Commission, the Commissioner's report basically said that the sector is a case of neglect. Now, that was based on 0.08% of care facilities being visited by the Commissioners, I think the number was. Mm-hmm. Now, there are plenty of operators in aged care in New Zealand and in Australia who do very thoughtful, very caring work for older people. And so I think to categorise the entire sector as a case of neglect is very sad, actually. And all I can talk about for us is that we're very dedicated to doing the very best. You know, the meeting all of the new, more challenging standards on an unannounced audit was really good validation to know that we're on the same page as the authorities. And I think that we have a unique culture at Ryman, you know, with kindness, and people can, it's hard to really explain, but when I ask residents, how come you chose coming to us? Often people will just say it's the warmth of the welcome, it's the smiles, we love the village, the terms are fair, they feel at home. So we see it as an opportunity when people are, I guess when people are worried about the decision that they make, and it is a big decision, people should take it very, very seriously, that we're just really well positioned to offer people a great choice. And so we're seeing, specifically at, say, Nellie Melba, we see lots of walk-ins every day. And it's often a massive relief for people who are very, very stressed and worried about what will I do with mum or dad, or themselves, where might I aspire to live, to come to a place where they think, you know what, I think this is going to be great. And it's one of the most important last decisions you can make. So that's what we're focused on doing well at.
Stephen, I'd agree with you. Reading the Royal Commission report was pretty sad reading, wasn't it? And but it is, as Gordy says, a relatively small number of operators. But there's been neglect on both sides, and that I don't think government have invested adequately. They've not set standards. They've not addressed funding of the aged care sector adequately. So it's been unravelling for quite some time. So look, it's a big job to get the community's confidence back in aged care in Australia. But you know, things like having a spot audit where we pass 100% makes a big difference in terms of our differentiating ourselves.
It's hard for staff.
Yeah, it's not,
because, you know, you read the paper each day and the sector you're working in just gets absolutely slammed.
Yeah.
And so it's not your friends who aren't in the sector are talking to you about it over dinner or a barbecue or something. It's being portrayed in the worst possible light across the board, and I think that's a shame. It's a real shame.
Jeremy Simpson at Forsyth Bar. Well done in your leadership position in dementia as well. It's fantastic. And in terms of the momentum building in Melbourne, I'm interested to get your thoughts on what the competitor response has been, and are you coming across other people when you're trying to buy sites, and are people, other local operators, you know, trying to step up as well?
Sometimes we have competition for sites. Quite a few recent ones though, Jeremy, we've actually bought off market because the team have identified opportunities through contacts, relationships. It's a very big market, and according to some of the industry experts that we deal with in aged care, there's not as much enthusiasm for building aged care right now. So that competition feels like it's sort of coming off a bit actually. And the reason for that is I think people are, worried about the Royal Commission. They're worried about their probably their personal liability exposure. It's pretty serious business, and they're just sort of waiting to see over the next couple of years how it pans out. Look, our view is that it's what residents need to have a continuum of care. We know that over 35 years. We are going to do that, and we're going to do it well, and that and whatever standards there are, we'll meet them. So that's why we see an opportunity to move now, and that's why you can see us really building momentum there.
And I think in terms of land becoming available to us, as our reputation has been established in Victoria, people start bringing stuff to us, and that's what we found here in New Zealand as well. So, provided we can keep our reputation in the same space, I think people will start thinking these are good operators, they're able to pay, this would suit them, and we get a jump on other people.
Just a couple of sort of numbers-related questions. Just your last thoughts on construction cost inflation in New Zealand, and is it still stable in Melbourne? And then what pricing are you seeing on bed bonds in Australia? And then lastly, what sort of resale gain have you been getting, say, at Weary Dunlop in Australia?
Yeah, you deal with the last two, I'll deal with the construction. So construction costs in Melbourne are stable, and we've seen some price increases there of recent times, so that, potentially the jaws are sort of widening a bit again there. Melbourne is a very good market to be, Victoria is a good market to be constructing in right now, particularly if you're doing sort of mid-rise. The reason for that is that there's a lot of building activity has dropped off in residential construction, and most particularly apartment construction. So some of the staff that we're recruiting, we're seeing people from whole design offices who otherwise are being made redundant. And so we were able to interview, for example, recently 73 people, and we're able to recruit the top 5. So it's a good market to be constructing in. One of our new sites that we're about to start working on, one of the big building companies there is really keen to do quite a large package of work for us on the structural front. And so it feels like a good time to be building in Australia over the next few years. And so therefore costs are actually good. In Auckland, if you think about the construction market, our biggest exposure right now is in the Auckland market. Look, costs have gone up, Jeremy, over the last wee while. We've seen cost pressure. I think it's been a function of quality of resource and also availability of resource, and just the way the materials supply chain works with the business model that operates in this country. So we just have to manage that, and how we do it is we have regular suppliers we deal with all the time, and it's a mutual partnership. So our construction manager, Tom Brownrigg, he got a phone call, he said to me a couple of days ago, from one of our big suppliers. We just paid them $1 million for the month for a lot of concrete work they've been doing for us, and he just called to say thanks. And the reason he did that was no one else is paying him on time. So those sort of things are really important for us with relationships, and that's why we can still get good pricing. But look, resources are tight, Jeremy, and so we have to manage that.
And then so on the aged care sort of bond side of things, if you look at Weary Dunlop, it's probably the one that you can talk to for the resale margin. When we first launched the village, our bonds were in the range of sort of 350 to 545. They're now priced at 550 through to 700. So there's been quite a significant lift in those since over the last 5 years. When we initially launched those, we didn't go to the pricing commissioner. We stayed below that level, but we've successfully been able to lift those through the pricing commission, so we can charge the high level of bonds there. And then if you look at Nellie Melba and launching that, the bonds sort of range from about 550 to 750 there, so a range of rooms. So yeah, good pricing and good lifts over the last 5 years on that side of things.
And just resale, Weary Dunlop, what sort of gain are you getting on to stick around with resales there?
Yeah, so the resale pricing has been strong. So if you think back again 5 years, during that initial 5 years, pricing in Marble went up sort of probably 30-odd%. It's come back a bit, but we were at quite a discount already. We're still sitting at a good discount, so we're getting good pricing. At So we're sort of seeing good 25-30% margins coming through there, which is the benefit of, I guess, good pricing on the first sell down.
Thanks, Jeremy. Shall we just see if there's anyone on the phone conference that's got a burning question?
Ladies and gentlemen on the phone, if you'd like to ask a question, please press star 1 on your telephone and wait for your name to be announced.
Sounds like a no, doesn't it? Is there any question? Thank you. Just mic over here, thanks.
Thanks. Jeremy Kincaid, UBS. Firstly, could you just talk about your experience at Malvina Major and the development work you undertook there, and whether or not there are any other villages that are exposed to similar earthquake remediation work?
Yeah, so the Kakura earthquakes that occurred in, was it 2014 now? 2015? Geez, I forget. 16, time passes by. So the Figaro block that was there, that we demolished that building the day after that it was affected by the earthquake significantly. There was no one injured, but the structural engineers really felt that the ability to repair it wasn't going to be practical relative to the work, just wasn't going to be practical. So what we did was residents actually were able to move to Bob Scott in Lower Hutt, where we recently constructed that village, and people have moved back to Figaro or other Ryman villages in the intervening time, just at their choice really, and any units that were able to be sold we did. So the reason why it's a margin of 0 is just that we just treat it as an earthquake rebuild. In terms of other stock around the country, there's no other repairs that we need to undertake anywhere. We're always, as part of being building owners, we need to be aware of the seismic ratings of all of our buildings. Various territorial local authorities have different guidelines for standards to be met within certain timeframes, and we just work closely with the property team to make sure we either meet or exceed those.
Okay, thank you. And then with your new banking partners, I might have missed it, have you increased your facility limit, or is it still 1.8 million?
Yeah. No, so the facility has lifted to just over $1.9 billion. So from 1.7. From 1.7. Yeah.
So should we interpret that as your modelling suggests you'll remain under 1.9 billion in the future?
Yes. Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And then just, could you talk about your ability to increase unit prices on the portfolio overall, and I suppose relative to regional house price inflation, and then I suppose also just with regards to markets that may have been flatter as well?
Yeah, so I think when you look at our portfolio, we benefit from having a very diverse portfolio sort of from a geographical spread perspective. The tough markets have obviously been Auckland and Melbourne, but they're actually the markets that we had the biggest headroom between our pricing and sort of the local real estate pricing at the time. So we've always been a slow follower. We want to follow the market, but we don't race to the top, because then we can just keep sort of getting gradual increases. So that's given us the ability to keep lifting over the last sort of 12 to 18 months when it's been a bit tougher.
Would you say you've been increasing unit prices faster than house price inflation?
Well, I guess if you look at a couple of those markets that have gone backwards and we've still been able to get increases, then yes, we have. But that's because we didn't take all the increases in the previous years. So we've just been able to slowly follow.
Thanks. And then just finally, your slide on population growth globally, should we interpret that as an intent to move further afield in the medium term, or am I misinterpreting that?
No, you're not misinterpreting it, but it's really more a demonstration of the opportunity that exists and the need that will develop, and that somebody has to start thinking about this.
And one of the reasons is that I think that graph is very important, is that we actually live on the same planet, all of us. And I don't really hear governments talk about the ageing of the population much. when the Labor government put out its health and wellbeing budget a few months ago, there was nothing on elderly people. Nothing. So, and I think it's an area of society that people just generally there isn't enough discussion about, because it is going to be profound. Look at those numbers, and the yellow line is Victoria, the other line is New Zealand, so it's the same shape, and then globally it's huge. So when I look at that, I think about, one, the challenge that we face, and two, it is a significant opportunity. And you don't know in the future how, something like a Ryman, may serve purpose outside of our immediate jurisdictions. We don't know. There are just challenges that are affecting older people globally, and we need to be aware of that, otherwise we've just got our blinkers on.
Stephen Ridgewell from Craig's Investment Partners, just with another follow-up. Gordon, you suggested before, in terms of the ambitions in Australia, that it's beyond Victoria, and that perhaps in the short to medium term there'll be consideration for expansion beyond the state's boundaries. Are you able to give us any colour as to which states perhaps or areas might suit the Ryman model?
I knew you guys would go right there. So we've ruled out the Northern Territory and Perth. But look, otherwise, Stephen, I think we just need to be really clear. We're focused on Victoria right now, but we're not just a 1 year, we don't think about, what do the next 6 months look like all the time. We're thinking about what do the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years look like. And look, we will be in more states in Australia, and who knows beyond that. So there is a significant opportunity for us to be able to provide something that I think is pretty unique to more people. And that might be with our current way of doing things, or, there's lots of different ways we can attack stuff. In terms of what states, Eastern Seaboard, I guess, is the most logical, but we're not, I just want to confirm, we're not doing current research around that right now, but I'm sure we will be. Yep.
Now, I gather there's a person on the phone line who has a question, so if we could just have their question.
We have a question from Mayor Kandawal from Kandawal & Co. Please go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. This is Meyer. I had a couple of questions. I guess one was a recent research report was talking about the cultural fit and the cultural orientation for the product, and it seems to have an Anglo bent. And I don't know if there is a healthy, if you find that to be true, not true, and also if it's true, I guess, does it preclude the real total number, the real TAM, if you will, of retirees or aged guests? And the second question was, I know it's a tougher question, but can you give a range from purchase to onboarding or welcoming guests, or range in time for a New Zealand purchase to bringing in New Zealand guests versus, from what you've learned now, an Australian purchase to welcoming Australian guests?
Okay, look, the second question is probably easier to answer, and we'll come back to your first question in just a moment. So, Gordy, the range of time between purchase of a site to actually a resident moving in, I think that's the nub of the question, comparing Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah. Is that what you mean, the development sort of time frame to get first residents in?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
So
okay, cool.
Yeah,
okay.
So from purchasing the property to actually, taking a guest in.
Yeah. Well, look, actually in both jurisdictions, if we look at what we've just achieved in Aberfeldy with a council that's good to work with and a focused team, we've been able to pretty much move forward in an 18-month time frame. And that's actually very similar to what we can achieve in New Zealand as well, with the right sort of things going our way. Where it can take longer on both sides is something like, again, Karori in New Zealand and Mount Eliza in the Mornington Peninsula. If there's issues around community or heritage, that sort of thing, it just becomes more complex and a little bit more uncertain. But the more sort of straightforward sites, My goal would be that we would maybe spend a year or so looking for and securing a site, maybe about a 12-month period doing a resource consent approval process, assuming it doesn't get subject to court proceedings. And then after that, you could be building within the third year, and in fact within both Victoria and New Zealand.
Just going back to your first question, would you mind rephrasing it? It was a cultural orientation to the product, and I just didn't quite catch beyond that. I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So the short of it is a bank issued a report comparing your facilities and the facilities of others, and they were questioning the TAM that the team kind of considers, right? So there's a total addressable market, seems to be fairly large, and the article says, or the investment bank report says, look, if you look at the total addressable market, it's not really the entire aged population. It's only those who are accustomed to a Anglo-New Zealand, Anglo-Australian kind of lifestyle, and that is a bit less than what the total addressable market is. And I'm just curious if that, I guess the real question then becomes, do you feel that your facilities are not wide open enough to people of different backgrounds and different experiences? And do you feel like you're painting yourself into a corner, or do you find that everybody is, even the background of your guests or everybody who's a retiree is looking for the same thing? I mean, for example, I think they said maybe, lawn ball games are not, universally accepted or universally enjoyed, I guess is a better term.
Sure.
And so some people may, not a fit there.
Yeah. No, I totally get what you're saying. So our villages are actually I joined Ryman back in January 2007, and I'd have to say that back then, our villages were predominantly white European New Zealanders. I mean, that's the reality. And as we have progressed into Auckland and into Melbourne, if I take Melbourne for example, when I was at our Weary Dunlop village the other day, I met a lot of our residents who are from Sri Lanka, for example, and they love living in the village. We've actually done some specific work with some of the way the kitchens and stuff are laid out for the sort of family cookings and that sort of thing that happen. They love living in the village. We have activities that sort of work for lots of different people. If I look at Edmund Hillary, I was there the other day, and some of our Chinese friends there were playing mahjong. So there was and doing Tai Chi in the morning. So I think that there's just naturally a bigger mix coming through than over the last few years, and I don't know whether I'm not sure whether people really want in society to have completely closed villages just for different ethnicity groups. We're finding that people are actually mixing really well. And when I did the Nellie Melba grand opening in February this year, there was lots of different cultures actually, from Greece, from Sri Lanka, from different parts of Europe. Italian, yeah. And so I think it's really cool. And with our staff as well, we have a significant ethnic mix too, so we're probably actually perfectly positioned to just sort of participate in that change in society, which is wonderful actually, where people don't have such divides between different cultures, because it doesn't need to be.
And maybe to round out the answer to your question, sir, it's really part of the due diligence that we undertake before we buy a site, to look at the ethnicity, the expectations of that community, the age distribution in the community, and that will determine whether we go to that site and also how we develop that site. So it's sort of it's part of our work before we even get going there.
Yeah. It's potentially,
okay. Great. And just to clarify the other question, thank you, that was very helpful. To clarify the other question, there was, you were saying that you spent a year before purchase to evaluate, and so once the purchase consummates, you talked about construction in year 3, and how long do you expect the successful sites to complete construction?
Yeah, so by the time you start construction, you'd be doing underway usually on 2 stages pretty much simultaneously. Your first maybe independent apartment block or a set of independent townhouses, and also starting the care centre as well. So those first independent units might take anywhere from 6 to 12 months, depending if they're townhouses or apartments. And usually the main build is, you know, like a 20,000 square metre building, so it could take 12 to 18 months, or probably more likely 18 months. So, and then we'd normally build out over a further, say, 3 years to complete the village, you know, just subject to demand. So in total, you'd be looking at a build time frame of probably sort of 4 to 5 years from the time you sort of start scratching on the earth.
Okay, and I understand that they're similar in New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah.
It's just the edge cases which throw things out.
Yeah, that's right. Dead right. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Are there any other questions from the floor? No, look, thank you very much for coming and joining us. We really do appreciate seeing with you. We're keen to mix with you informally now, and we've made lots of progress. We're looking forward to a busy second half, and we look forward to reporting to you again in 6 months.
And thanks to everyone who watched us.
Yeah.
Thank you.